Hi, welcome to Someone Else's Movie, the podcast where an actor, writer, director, or nebulous industry figure gives a little love to a movie they didn't make. I'm Norm Wilner, senior film writer for Now Magazine, and this is the other thing I do. My guest this week is Jennifer Baichwal, a documentary filmmaker whose remarkable body of work includes Watermark, Payback, Manufactured Landscapes, Act of God, and Let It Come Down, the Paul Bowles Story. Her latest film is Long Time Running, which follows the Tragically Hip on their final concert tour following the terminal diagnosis of frontman Gord Downie. Directed by Jen and her longtime partner and cinematographer Nick DePonsier, friend of the show, it's a love letter to the band and its legacy, and one of the most eloquent goodbyes to an inspiration and a friend that we could ever ask for. Obviously, Canadians are going to take it a little more seriously than the rest of my audience, but believe me, Gord Downie was something special, and so is this film. Jen chose The Dead Zone, David Cronenberg's magnificent 1983 adaptation of Stephen King's novel about Johnny Smith, an unremarkable schoolteacher who emerges from a 5-year coma with psychic powers that help him solve crimes, save lives, and eventually conclude that in order to save the world, he must murder a presidential candidate named Greg Stilson. It's one of the best Stephen King adaptations, if not the best, powered by just basically one of Christopher Walken's finest performances, and a masterfully chilly tone. And it was really shocking in researching this to realize that it's kind of evaporated over the decades. I'm very glad we had the chance to talk about it. One small thing. Circumstances forced us to record this episode in a conference room at Elevation Pictures, so there's a little more background noise than usual. It shouldn't be too bad, though, except for that one intrusion of a siren. But it works out in the end. This is Someone Else's Movie.
Well, because it's one of those films that has stayed with me for a really long time. And I'm more, as you know, a doc person. So if I was going to talk about Sans Soleil or Volcano, which Nick chose, or Ladies and Gentlemen, Mr. Leonard Cohen, or ones that have been very formative to me, there was that. And then I just thought, no, I should go outside of my comfort zone. And somehow I saw this very early on, and it's sort of, there are moments in it that have haunted me for years. So, and watching it again, I haven't seen it in so long, and watching it again, I was reminded of why. And it's almost like my fascination with it, they were precursors to things that I did in my own life or studied in my own life that are brought up in that film. So I was already kind of fascinated by the more meta level of it, and then I went on to study ethics and philosophy and all of the kind of things that are brought up in that film.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a thought experiment movie before we knew what those were, almost.
Yeah.
In that you're presented with potential threats, theoretical challenges, and because it's Cronenberg, it's intellectualized in a way that few other horror films would have done. I mean, I remember the experience of seeing it. I would have been, I think I was 15,
right,
in 83, and I went down from school to the Eaton Center because they were having a day show that I could get to, and I saw it at, I don't know, 4:15, 5 o'clock show, and it was just so not what I was expecting, having gorged on King and the horror films that were coming out with King's adaptations at the time. Like Creepshow had been the year before, and The Shining, obviously, and he was just starting to crystallize as the creative force he became in the 80s. And I'd read the book and was just stunned at how calm and placid and unnerving the movie version is. And still, it's the only Cronenberg, it's the only King adaptation that does that really thinks its way through the story and treats the characters as real people. The supernatural is completely outside of what's happening to Johnny Smith, and we are trying to understand it with him.
Exactly, even though, I mean, it's interesting you say that he intellectualizes it, because I am so not a thriller person.
Okay.
And the thing that made me, that was just so overwhelming about it to me, it's a very tight film. Like, it moves. I mean, it has the plot that moves, inexorably towards the end. It's all very tight. There's nothing superfluous there. And yet, it has such depth of emotion. Like, I think the most powerful thing for me, the thing that I've remembered for years, is this one scene where he goes to the door of his new house that he's, hiding, and he opens it, and it's his girlfriend with her new husband campaigning for the Martin Sheen character. And he closes the door, and he kind of pulls the boy to him for this moment of comfort.
The kid he's been tutoring.
Yeah, the kid that he's been tutoring, and the one that he has this special bond with because of things, had that happened before?
No, the vision is triggered by the hug. That's right. Because you get this beautiful, sad moment, which is immediately shattered.
Yeah, immediately shattered and becomes this. But it was that moment I thought, oh my God, I don't know any other actor that is capable of such depths of vulnerability without being a wimp. Like he just doesn't, I don't know, there's something, and it's a little bit in The Deer Hunter too, but there's something about his performance that has such depths in that way. So a thriller with that is, as you say, they're real characters. That just never happens. There's never a thriller that I've seen that has that kind of depth of character. But at the same time, this sadness, like we have this saying in our house, sad or thoughtful. And I will always say thoughtful. And interestingly, my son will say thoughtful, and my daughter and Nick say sad. Okay. So it is kind of funny because it's that there's always that balance there, and you feel it in him. You feel this kind of sadness, which is triggered by, and you're right, the supernatural element of it, of him being able to see the future, is not kitschy at all. It's this profound ethical, moral dilemma, of what you do with this stuff. Remember when he sees his doctor, what happened to him,
the Holocaust flashback with Herbert
flashback, and then realizes his mother is still alive. And I was always astonished that the doctor doesn't phone his mother. It was not meant to be. Remember, he says it twice.
Yeah, that incredible delivery, too, in Herbert Lom, who I had only ever seen in the Pink Panther movies and had no idea that he was capable of this depth. But,
it was not meant to be.
Yeah,
I know.
The idea that the power is something he doesn't want, that's standard. That's your classic science fiction or superhero. I didn't want this responsibility. I don't want it thrust on me. But the idea that I'm going to roll back a little bit because Stephen King had said, I remember being shocked when I read this years later, in an interview somewhere, King said he wanted to write a story about a presidential assassin from the assassin's point of view and show you that the man thinks he's justified. That was his original idea for the Dead Zone.
Oh, really?
And it makes no sense with the film that we see, right?
No,
because the movie is completely on Johnny's side. And Stilson is a menace, and even though we're told there's an ambiguity about Johnny being able to affect the future, that there are things he can see and things he can't see, the film never shows us that, right? We never see his dead zones. We only see what he sees. And so he's allowed to doubt it, but we're not. The audience is we're pretty sure Greg Stilson is going to end the world if he becomes president.
Yes.
And so we're completely on his side, on the side of the man who is planning to kill a political candidate.
Well, and he has that, and of course, the letter that he writes where he doesn't even explain exactly what happens to his girlfriend or why he's doing it, but she trusts him somehow. And that last moment where she says, "I love you."
And again, a brilliant stroke of writing because it's not her in the book. Brooke Adams becomes the through line because just of narrative efficiency. There was Cronenberg told a story once about how he and the screenwriter Jeffrey Boehm and Deborah Hill locked themselves in a hotel room. I think it might have even been at the Royal York, and banged it out.
Wow.
And figured out how to tell the story, because the book is huge.
I didn't read the book.
It's got digressions. Stilson is tracked alongside Johnny. There are flashbacks. He's introduced as a teenager kicking a dog to death. Just so we know he's a bad person. And again, that's King sort of selling out his own concept. There's no question this guy deserves to be killed.
Sure.
And they just realized that this 500-page book would feel... it would, I think they said drift. I think that was how Cronenberg said, it would get loose and the story would get away from them while they were telling the story. So they realized that the thing to do is to put Sarah in it from beginning to end and have her be campaigning and have her be at the rally and have it be her kid. And none of those things is in the book. They're all random occurrences.
Oh, that's fascinating.
But it absolutely hits it all home. And
it does.
Also makes you feel like you're watching something that's predestined.
Yes.
This has to happen, because why else would these people keep reoccurring in each other's lives?
No, exactly. It's true. And then that moment where, when they have their little "some things are worth waiting for," I think for me, the combination of this very taut sort of thriller. Remember, there's that whole thing with the girls getting killed first, and the gruesome death of the
Frank Dodd,
second in command,
Castle Rock killer.
The
right?
Castle Rock killer.
And I think it's the first mention of Castle Rock in the King's cinematic universe
really?
as we're going. But yeah.
Oh, that's funny. Well, all that. So that's just purely gruesome, but a perfect way of introducing him and this gift or whatever it is that he has. But it's him wrestling with the moral dilemma of it, right? And the relationships. That's the thing that I found the most fascinating about it, because there's always that question of, if you can affect an outcome, would you do it? Does the end justify the means, right? And there's so many, I mean, that's just a simple way of talking about it, but the reams of paper that have been written, the philosophical sort of debates around whether that is permissible or not. And it just happens in that one moment where he's talking to the doctor, where he said, I'd kill the bastard, if you could go back in time.
Yeah, you'd never get away alive, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And just it feels so prescient now
I know.
that we are, and there was a point last year where someone asked the Republican candidates, would you kill baby Hitler? And everybody hummed and hawed, and Trump said, yep, sure, absolutely. And I'm like, oh Christ, of course he would. Of course he'd say that, because there's no thought.
Yeah.
And then here we are watching this movie. I mean, the Royal Cinema in Toronto screened the film on Inauguration Day, which
You're
just
kidding.
seemed a little on the nose to me.
I have to tell you some of my favorite moments. First of all, the score. So as soon as I heard that score again, Michael Kamen, I was totally haunted by it, and I realized I've been haunted by it for years, and I remember it is a heavy-handed score, but it's very effective, and the thematic, the fact that it keeps coming back, the stills in the beginning to set the context and the mood really felt to me that was sort of a documentary touch, which I liked. Remember that?
Yeah, and the pieces of the screen falling away at first, making no sense whatsoever, and then revealing the title. I saw it the second time I saw it at the Regent, and the story had been going around that Cronenberg was haunting the popcorn machine. Like, he was just going to the screenings and listening in Toronto, and I was hoping I'd run into him, obviously.
Yeah.
Because at 15, you just assume that's going to happen.
Of course.
He wasn't there, but I got to watch it with an audience the second time, having seen it 2 days earlier and being ahead of most of them, and just watching them figure out the credits and watching that play through the rest of the score sort of leads you there. It happens in Dead Ringers, too. He's really good at just guiding you towards the tone of the film an hour and a half before he tells you what the tone is. Exactly,
and also just the efficiency of the way those scenes happen. Like, the accident is looming and ominous, and you don't really see what. I mean, all you see is that milk container coming through the lights of it. It's a beautiful shot, but that's all you need. Like, it just has this menace about it. And what was what were some of the things? I loved it when he said, God's been a real sport to me.
Yes,
because that was right. Remember that?
Yeah, that's a great monologue too. It's really short, it's really forced, and he's Walken. I think he doesn't get enough credit as a leading man just because he was never used as one, really.
I know, but
he was immediately thrown into stuff like The Dogs of War, where you're a guy, and he inhabits those roles in an interesting way. But when you ask him to be a person instead of a guy, when you ask him to have a life internally, he's just fascinating. And in The Dead Zone, you get the sense that Johnny's a little weird. Like, even from the beginning, just even the way he puts his hand to his forehead is just wrong on this tiny level. It doesn't look like something people would do naturally, and he's clearly thought it through and built it into the character so that it becomes second nature, but it's an affectation. And watching him relate, just the scene with the journalists, the scene with people, he's going to be that guy who people say, oh yeah, he was quiet, he kept to himself. I don't know why he picked up a gun and tried to kill somebody, but he's building all of that into the life of a tormented, ordinary man who isn't allowed to be ordinary.
Yes, exactly. But who would be kind of an eccentric that people, if nothing had happened to him, people would say that's so weird that he's the guy who did the assassination. So maybe in the end, the thread of that, the kind of person that would do this, does come out very well. because he does have that weirdness with the journalist. Remember that thing?
Yeah.
It's not okay. It's not okay. And he's saying that, and the guy's getting so weirded out by this weirdo, right?
Yeah.
But so you could see how, if you looked at it from the other perspective, that he would be a lunatic who assassinated somebody.
Yeah, he's even a little weird with his kids. You know, you're going to like it. It's about a school teacher chased by a headless demon. And he's taking so much pleasure in scaring them.
Yeah.
And that's before anything out of the ordinary happens. He's reading The Raven. He's giving himself that performance.
Well, The Raven was sort of a perfect,
Yeah.
a perfect text. But then you wonder, so when we think about his other roles, because, of course, I loved him in The Deer Hunter, and I'm thinking back to other things I've seen, and I think I was always wondering, why isn't he more of a leading man? And maybe it's just because he doesn't fit a caricature of, hero or villain or everyman.
Yeah.
You know?
He's always been a little odd, even when he was supposed to be on that trajectory.
Right.
I'm thinking like Pennies from Heaven or...
Yes.
Or even just the scene in Annie Hall where Woody Allen uses him so perfectly, that delivery married to a kind of strangeness. May I confess something to you? He's so perfect at it, and I've never seen him on stage, and I would love to have that experience someday, just because I imagine he would be electric.
In terms of Cronenberg's trajectory, what number was this for him?
I think this was his 5th feature. It would have been... Well, the Stereo and Crimes of the Future, but then the features were Shivers, Rabid, The Brood, Videodrome, Dead Zone. No, Scanners, Videodrome, Dead Zone. So this was his 6th feature. His first studio feature, technically, on Universal picked up Videodrome, but I don't think they produced it.
So could you say that this was a mark of a shift to... Because all of those other films are I mean, they're great. Fantastic, but they don't have the psychological subtlety of this.
Yeah,
right?
Well, none of them is as polished.
No.
This is the first one with Steadicam, I think. This is the first one where he's quiet. Videodrome is a psychotic break on film. It's assaultive and aggressive. Scanners had the exploding heads and the melting bodies. And it's really good at it. Although that's one of those films where I revisited it a couple of years ago because we did a National Canadian Film Day screening of it with Stephen Lack, so I watched it again before just so I could have the intro. That is a movie that is amazingly wrong about the near future.
Right.
Just the production design, they were like 20 degrees off. And it's amazing to watch that and see just how wrong everything is. Not in a negative way. You're just like, that's what they thought this would be. That's what they thought computers would do. And then 2 years later, he makes Videodrome, and it is predicting YouTube and the internet and social media. All of it is in there, just sort of bubbling around. And it was as though that he'd made Scanners and said, well, I'm not going to get caught again. I'm just going to make it all allegorical and I'm going to allude to things. And he nailed it.
And so maybe that was the turning, although as you say, it is like a psychotic break. So it's not, but the subtlety of this film, and that gets carried on into later work as well, like the layers of meaning. I mean, you could read this film as just a straight thriller, and you could read it like that, and it would be fine, and it would work. But to me, it's those meta levels of philosophy and morality that make it, that really enrich it, as well as the performances. You know.
Well, his next 3 features, I think. I mean, even really, the first turning point I think in his career is The Dead Zone, because it puts him in line to make studio films, to work with bigger actors. Then there's The Fly and Dead Ringers, which are discussions about the themes that they are about.
Yes,
they're
exactly.
long scenes of people just talking through their psychology.
Yeah, they're already reflecting on, they're the thing, and then they're the reflection on the thing at the same time, which is, you appreciate that depth.
Yeah.
And maybe he just found it, and then he knew, and maybe sometimes he went too far that way afterwards.
Well, M. Butterfly is one that I keep meaning to revisit, because I really want to see 20 years on how it handles the text.
Oh God, that's right.
Because everybody, that's the forgotten one.
Yes, exactly.
I think it's still the only one. No, that and Crash are the 2 films you can't find on
Crash,
high
really?
def. Yeah, it just went away.
Interesting.
Well, it's part of the New Line library, and
sure.
I think it'll turn up as a Warner Archive disc eventually. I'm still hoping Criterion gets their hands on it. But even this, The Dead Zone, that Blu-ray is from Australia.
You're kidding.
Yeah, there's still no version of it in North America. I think it just became slightly less important to Paramount at some point.
You know, it's interesting because my mom just sent me an email saying, "Tell Magnus," that's our son, that the Trimming Pictures is $900 on Amazon because we.
Which is
the video that the DVD we had. I think it was New Video that released it. They went bankrupt, and we tried to get the materials back from them, and we never got them. So we just put it online on Vimeo so people could buy it or watch it. And so these DVDs have become, like, I can't imagine anybody would buy it for that much, but that's the value of them. Like, a used one is $300 and a new one, she just saw, was $900.
Yeah. Well, I think
is that what happens?
I think it's basically a kind of, what do they used to call it, eBay sniping, where you would just set the buy it now price at a ludicrous point, because if you had one sucker who was willing to do it, then this is what you think you can get for it.
I'm sure that's what it is.
Yeah.
I cannot imagine anybody paying for that. I have to remember, the first time I met David Cronenberg was right after we had made our Paul Bowles film.
Okay.
And I was trying to find quotations that we could use because I thought I had to do that. And so I wrote to Michael Ondaatje, and he was very kind and provided this beautiful quote, like, it's the conversation with Paul Bowles you always wanted to have. I think that one was from Michael. No, that's from Cronenberg. Okay. There was one from Michael and one from Cronenberg, and so I walked up to him. It was at some reception that I had no business being at, and I was quite nervous. And I just said, I know Paul Bowles and Ken, will you consider giving us a quote? And so I gave him a copy of it, and he did. And it was just such a great act of generosity for somebody. That was our first feature, right? Mm-hmm. So it wasn't for him to do that at that moment, and also to really get it, that it kind of, because he knew Bowles, and so to get it and to get that was actually his character. So I'm eternally grateful for that. And of course, the thought that, and I had no idea when I watched this movie 20 years ago, well, longer than, 20 years ago, longer, that would happen, whatever.
Yeah, they say you shouldn't meet your heroes, but Cronenberg's always been somebody I'm just delighted to talk to. He's everybody says the same thing, which is that he's funnier than you think he'll be.
Right.
But his movies are wry in a way that kind of open up once you get to understand him better. Over the range of his filmography, The Fly has all that gallows humor, of course, sure. and Dead Ringers is kind of funny a lot in its tiny little details, but never explicitly so. The Dead Zone does it more through irony, I think. Yes. I mean, I remember him saying, I think it was Fangoria, bless Fangoria for helping me find this movie when I was a kid, because I read all the horror movie magazines.
Okay.
And, they would lead with the bloodiest photograph they could find. And in The Dead Zone, there's not much. No. There's Nicholas Campbell.
Well, there's just the
scissors through
the scissors. Yeah, that was a nice touch.
It's a great image. And that shiver always freaks people out.
Yes.
Every time I've seen it in a theater, there's always this movement when the body convulses. But it's great because it's a coroner's observation. He just knows this is the thing that happens.
Yes.
And he had said that he loved the irony of a milk truck sending Johnny to sleep for 5 years, and it's something that no one gets, because all you see is Jesus Christ, there's a huge truck coming at him, and the milk is a beautiful image, but I don't think any of us in the theater in the moment just think, oh, of course, it's what you drink before you go to sleep if you're a child. And it's like, no, this guy's just horribly injured and almost drowning maybe. But it's there, right? It's just floating through
all of that. I mean, and things that you could consider to be plot devices, like the sign goes up right outside of his house for Stilson.
Yeah. And if you were an assassin with an obsessive conscience, that would happen too. I mean, it's all completely likely and also really absurd.
Yes, I know. And you could read it. You could tell the story a completely different way of a deranged individual who, had an accident and then lost his girlfriend and was bitter for the rest of his life and tried to go away and then had to do this act of revenge or something, right? Mm-hmm. You could see it that way. And that's the great thing about, when I talk about that vulnerability without wimpiness, it really is a tough balance to be as vulnerable and kind of sad as he is, without you thinking, buck up, pal, like, whatever, you're alive, it's all right. And he did. I don't know how he does it. I've thought about that performance, and I've thought about what kind of conversations they must have had. He and Cronenberg must have had about that, the fragility and the strength at the same time, right? And he's always physically, messed up,
cane, right?
He's got the cane, and so he can't really walk properly. But you never get this feeling about him as being weak.
He's tired, though. That's the thing that I always come back to, is how tired he is, and how by the end of the film he comes out and says, like, this is eating him. It's taking
that it's died, killing him. Yeah,
and it's a way to. I think he thinks it's a way to make his death meaningful, to do this thing that he's barreling towards. But it also feels like it'd be a relief for him, because he'll have achieved whatever purpose. And you can read that as psychosis or honesty. And the way Walken delivers it, he's just so sad, and he's ready. And
you're right. He's sad and tired, but his fatigue is an existential fatigue, right? And that's also what makes it really interesting, because he's tired of carrying the weight around of that responsibility. There's this interesting line in the Bible where John says, "He will increase and I must decrease. He must increase and I must decrease," meaning Christ, Jesus Christ, must increase and he must decrease. And I always got this feeling a bit that he was slowly, the life was ebbing out of him the more that he saw what could have been from the past. And that was really interesting too. Like, how does that connect you to some kind of, metaphysical web of meaning?
And of course, the larger question of why is this happening to him? I mean, is it just... I've always wondered about this, because in any story about psychics or any story about possible futures, the thing that bothers me the most about the 5 Final Destination films is that they never explain why the kid has the vision in the first place. Who is letting that door open?
Right.
And if there is a religious aspect, and I don't know that there is in Cronenberg's thinking, because I'm pretty sure with him, dead is dead, and there's no redemption, there's no afterlife.
I'm sure of that too.
He seems pretty atheistic.
He is, except the window onto, there is a metaphysical level to having that second sight. Second sight is, by definition, metaphysical. Yeah. So to play around with that language without theologizing it, you don't need to do that, which I think is really interesting too, that he is able to do that he's able to kind of exist on this plane and explore these themes without devolving into either that imagery or that kind of outright moralizing. Yeah, it's one of the things that bugged me about that Borg versus McEnroe movie was this sort of overt kind of Christ-like imagery around Borg. It was kind of, come on, like he's in the shower on the ground and stuff, and it's like, it's not that hard.
I think Bjorn Borg was the Messiah, and we all missed it. That's the point of that film, clearly. And Shia is the devil, which, we all kind of suspected.
Exactly.
No.
But that's such a heavy-handed, it's just such a, come on, really, do you have to do that?
Yeah, no, he doesn't go for that. But we do have characters who are invested in the idea that everything has meaning, like just the same way that Herbert Lom says it wasn't meant to be, that presumes that something is designed or designated or orchestrated in such a way. And the fact that Johnny's visions almost always involve life or death moments.
Yes.
The one time I think that it doesn't is you want to know why your sister killed herself, which is just as bad, I think, to someone whose life isn't in danger, right? Like, that's the greatest question.
Well, it's still, because it also implied, like, that the reason that moment was quite powerful is that the guy is so freaked out and he's trying to move his hand away and he doesn't want to know. But I think, I always thought that meant he was implicated somehow.
Oh, really?
And the family, well, not that he killed her, but that it was something about, because he kept saying, no, it's not all right. It's not all right, meaning you can't hide from this because actually there is something, there is a bigger issue here that you have to take responsibility for.
Mm-hmm.
So that, maybe I made that up, but it was this idea of taking on, taking on responsibility and the ultimate responsibility of changing the future.
Yeah.
To say, did you used to do that thing I was growing up, I would think if something bad happened, I'd do the endless regress back to, and if I'd never been born, the magical thinking thing, but if I hadn't have left the house at that moment, you do that, and you just keep going backwards and backwards and backwards. And so there's something about the inverse of that in this film, the capacity to be able to change something. And that scene, I always remember that scene when he gets his cane, smashes the vase. The ice is gonna break.
Yeah.
And he's so not that kind of person, and yet you see this force, and the guy doesn't listen to him anyway, but he saves the boy.
Yeah, that Cassandra aspect would be, I think that's the thing that Cronenberg gets that nobody else gets.
Yeah.
In these stories, you would be, there was an episode of Buffy that came close. Towards the end of the series, there's an episode with, who's the terrific actress, had one episode where she played someone who just said, I'm going to die. And all the other stuff around her, she was a teenager, she knew that something was going to end her life that day, but she couldn't explain what it was. And in the end, she's saved from various threats, and then her heart gives out.
Right.
But that performance is the only other time I've seen anybody sort of have that kind of awareness that being psychic would be awful. It would be like Holly Hunter in broadcast news. What's it like being the smartest person in the room? It's terrible.
Right.
It would be exhausting. No one would listen to you, or everyone would listen to you and they wouldn't leave you alone. But there's no good end once you disclose that you have this ability. And in the Dead Zone, it's a burden from beginning to end. He saves the people he cares about, but at the cost of everyone else hating him, and then ultimately of his own life.
Of his own life, which felt like it was a relief. I mean, when he says goodbye at the end, it was a relief to him, that it was over. It's interesting because I've always, from personal experience, I remember somebody once saying to me, it's going to be all right before something happened. And it wasn't all right.
It's never all right.
But then it was, but what I wanted to say back, you don't know that it's going to be all right. So you can't, this is the opposite of that, saying, don't worry, it's going to be okay. You don't know that because you can't predict the future. So what you really should be saying is, no matter what happens, I'll be there for you or whatever. You can do it that way, but don't say the it's going to be all right thing because you don't know.
Yeah, I'm certainly guilty of that myself. And I wonder if it isn't just because from the outsider's perspective it will be okay. I'll still be here.
Perhaps.
But that's not what I'm saying.
But no, that's not what people are saying. And it becomes this thing. There's this beautiful John Ashbery poem, one of my favorites of his, called Saying It to Keep It From Happening. And I often do that as a kind of talisman. So when the kids are getting out of the car and, whatever, don't be careful, don't get hit by a car. Or, I always go through the scenario when we're flying somewhere. We were just coming back from California and we're going to shoot in the UK next week. And the thing of, okay, what happens if this plane crashes and we're both here? But I do all of these sort of thought experiments because it would be so improbable that I would say it or that I would think it and then it would actually happen, that I'm kind of insuring myself by doing that, by not being able to read the future. So I'm always sort of drawing attention to the fact that I can't, as a way of, assuaging my sense of anxiety about those things. And so it's a bit of that, that's what that is. It's going to be okay, is saying it to keep it from happening in a way.
Because otherwise, I have no idea. I can't function. I have to be able to say that I have some control by saying it's going to be all right. I'm proclaiming this. I'm pronouncing it. And sadly, Kate has a math degree and keeps telling me, that doesn't work, right? The odds are the same every time.
The probability aspect of it.
And I always said, I don't think I heard that. I refuse to believe you said that.
Well, see, that's a whole other interesting way of looking at the world. If you think about it, I'm just trying to relate it back to the Dead Zone, the idea of mathematics, or the idea of that kind of probability, the probability of Stilson being that path really happening for him, right, and interrupting it by changing it. I wonder if you could do some kind of a chart of mathematical outcomes based on if somebody was able to change the course of events, would history really change? Or would somebody else just fill that void?
That's the endless debate in science fiction, right? There's always I shot Hitler, but his chancellor became Hitler too.
Exactly.
Someone else rises up. I think the film comes up with, and the book too, the book does do it, they come up with this beautiful ending where he doesn't kill him, but he destroys him by revealing himself.
Yes.
And that's beautifully articulated in the movie because all the sound goes away and you just have that cigarette with the smoke and the desperation of Martin Sheen's. I don't think we give Martin Sheen enough credit.
You know what? He was pretty great.
Yeah.
He was really great.
He is incredibly good at being empty in a way that I didn't know he could be.
Well, that kind of psychotic emptiness, that drive that has nothing behind it, you know.
That wolfish smile he puts on, but he turns it on. You see it happen 2 or 3 times, where he just gets into Stilson mode.
Yes.
And then the fact that he's a religious zealot, which actually makes me feel good about Trump, is that Trump is never going to come out and say hallelujah after launching a war. He'll just, he'll get mad and push the wrong password in. I'm not worried about him with the nuclear codes because he doesn't have the presence of mind to finish whatever crypto code they give him.
Well, that's generous of you, but
it's the only time I will be generous about Donald Trump.
But it's possible. No, Martin Sheen is incredible in that, and I have to say, all of the performances they weren't caricatures. Like there was, and maybe it was the small town aspect of it. And I think the other thing that gets me when I watching it again after so long is that that's sort of my time. Like I those houses and the way people decorated, and I grew up in that time.
Yeah.
So I have a kind of nostalgia. And I thought he got the small town kind of feel perfectly. You know, the girl in that, whatever that thing is, the gazebo in the middle of the park, and come on over here for a second, I have something to show you. And of course she goes over because she's just given him a coffee, you know, that morning, that kind of thing. Like I love the smallness of all of that. And then, you know, the fact that there is this horror, which of course happens everywhere, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking Paul Bernardo wasn't much longer after that, right? I mean,
God.
It's all this Ontario echo. I want to say they shot it in Stratford or Niagara-on-the-Lake. It's definitely...
It has that look, for sure.
Lake Ontario kind of feel to it. And this desolation and the way that it moves through its episodes, too. It's always winter, but time is passing.
Yeah.
I think the Stilson sequences, there's one scene in the fall, the trees are changing.
The trees are changing and it's a little bit sunny, but otherwise it's either at night or it's, Yeah, it's
that tiny glint of hope, because that's when Sarah visits him.
Sure.
And it's immediately taken away. But, it feels like my childhood too. It feels like that thing that King does, that in small town nostalgia, recreated in Canada, that has nothing to do with the setting, but we rebuilt it really well.
It worked perfectly. It's interesting because we were just listening to On Writing on a trip. We went to the U.S. Open for a day at the very end of the whole, just after finishing the sound mix for the hip. So it's all finally put to bed and we can focus on our kids for a little bit. And we drove down there and we listened to On Writing, because our son's taking a writing course. And it's such a great book.
It is. It really
because
is.
One of the things he says that is so interesting is that don't go out and look for things to write about if you want to be a writer. Just develop the capacity to recognize the things as they happen in your own experience that are worthy of writing about. And I thought that was kind of really good advice for a writer.
Yeah, King's when he writes nonfiction, I enjoyed reading his books, his novels, but I remember having a real response to Danse Macabre, which just turned me on to all these other sources of horror that I hadn't been aware of yet. It's where I first heard about Richard Matheson. I would have been 12, but it was an amazing resource. And On Writing came along, and after a decade of sort of painkiller-fueled insanity in his books, it's this placid, soft, thoughtful
and
resource.
Talk about the small town experience and starting the paper with his brother and doing all of that, and he was addicted to comics too. I mean, he kept making. Have you read it? Like, he kept making comics and taking them in and selling his own horror stories, serial horror stories in the school, and then getting in trouble for it. And but it all had a kind of patina of Norman Rockwell about it.
Small town Maine kid, right? I mean, working class, you make your own fun. And I wonder, I'm sure there will be another kind of seismic force in genre like that, like King was in the 80s, just because the world works the same way, whatever technology you're playing with. I just don't know where it'll come from next. And I don't think they tried to make the Dead Zone into a television series, and it worked. It was an episodic. It ran for 6 or 7 seasons. Yeah, Anthony Michael Hall was the lead.
Oh, God.
It's fine. It actually, they just built the relationship. They went back and made it about his relationship with, Tom Skerritt's character, the chief, I can never remember the name of.
So he becomes a sort of a helper.
He's a consultant. It's a procedural. And it's fine, but it's not sad. It's somebody who's well-adjusted with his psychic gift, and it doesn't. And the Stillson thing runs through it. There's this thing going on. The C story, or the D story, is this other guy rising up to power that he will eventually have to come to confront. And I never finished the show, so I don't know how they resolved it. But I thought, okay, if you're going to build a show out of that, you could do it, but you need this to show you what not to do, because this film is just the perfect distillation of the actual text.
And without the sadness, without his sadness, that existential sadness, really, and existential fatigue, the whole thing just becomes sort of like an action thriller. It is about that's why I keep going back to it, that all of these issues of philosophy and ethics and meaning in life and mortality and these questions, these huge questions, that all are sort of very comfortably existing in this taut, thriller, number one, but also the depth of character, that he carries it through it. Really, they all have it, but he is the gravitational force of that film, and it is the sadness, that pulling the boy towards him and doing, that you're right, his thing with putting his hand on his forehead, and that moment was just heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking because of how I felt about it. And it was an echo of the moment where he turns his head away in the bed. Remember when, that's a great cameo by Jackie Burroughs, and she's so good at that, where she says she cleaves to another man. And you're like, oh my God, this is your mother? No wonder you're a little bit weird. But that's when he turns away in the bed, because that was also, that was a moment. That was a precursor of the moment where he pulls the boy to him. So, sad or thoughtful, vulnerability without wimpiness. Those are the two things, I think.
I'm still amazed this film hasn't survived as well as some of the others have. It's just sort of slid away.
I know. And
maybe it's because in the Stranger Things renaissance of all things King, it just doesn't fit.
Yeah.
Because it is too adult. There's no fun, there's no joy. It's a sad route. It
is sad, but there is a subtlety to it, and I think that's what makes it different from, especially the films that came before. And even, I suppose, it is anomalous, but that's why I like it so much.
Oh yeah, me too. And the other thing too that I was going to ask you about, do you know how Cronenberg staged the psychic sequences, the flash scenes?
No.
Okay, this is a great story, and it's one of the things that I find absolutely fascinating watching the film again. He would fire a starter pistol, so everyone would flinch. And in the shots, in these specific takes where that is about to happen, you can see the actors start to prep because they either know it's coming or they've already shot the scene once. And there is this subtle, disquieting tension that rolls through because their faces don't quite look right. They're braced.
That's fascinating.
And it gets into your brain. And
wow.
Yeah, I found that out before my last theatrical screening of it anyway. And I watched the audience to see if I could figure out if they were responding to it. But there is something, especially in Walken, because he's doing it over and over again.
Yes.
There's a tension in his eyes, like a watchfulness, because he's terrified of guns. And I don't think Cronenberg knew that. But
I didn't know that either.
He's terrified of physical prop guns on sets. There's a story about how...
Well, that makes the deer hunter scene even more... devastating than it actually is. Oh my God.
And there's a story about him, I love this story. He told it on Inside the Actors Studio. But there's a story about him shooting at close range with Sean Penn. There's a scene where Penn confronts him and holds a gun to his head. And they rehearsed it with a prop gun. And Penn knew he wasn't crazy about guns and somehow decided that he would, just before they started shooting, he took the gun away and said, I'm not sure I like this one, let's try another gun. And Walken is absolutely terrified of it. He doesn't know that it's got a blank. He knows it's a prop, but he's not sure because he likes to handle them and make sure. And the energy coming off of him, he puts his hand up in front of it. He won't look at the muzzle of the thing. He's spitting his dialogue out to get it. He's terrified. And you can almost see it. I mean, you can definitely see it in the scene with Stilson on the Trail.
Right.
Because it's a big space, and I'm pretty sure Cronenberg is right behind the camera with it, and he's just not looking out of one eye, squinting away. But otherwise, all the other actors are also jumping. Like, that was the way that he could make sure they were jumped at the same time. He fired a starter pistol into the air, and just, it adds this extra level of tension that intrudes, because it isn't until the cut that shot starts.
It's true. It's interesting, because I've always wondered about how there, when it's so sudden a thing that happens, because it happens with the handshake, that there would be this ominous feeling that pervade. It really is a foreboding feeling before those things happen. And I'm trying to remember if that's because I know that those scenes are going to happen, or whether I felt that in the beginning. And maybe it has something to do with that, because the whole scene is foreboding at that moment, at those moments before it happens.
Yeah, I think you can see the energy. I think you can just see the actors. It's in their physicality, but there's something going on that is about to happen.
Fascinating.
And yeah, it turns into this. And of course the music shrieks too, that string score just... Speaking of intrusive noises. Hopefully this isn't registering too badly, but maybe we should wait it out.
Let's wait a bit, because... so that is a fascinating thing, because I have always felt that foreboding feeling in those scenes and wonder what it is before the exact moment of the flashback starts. And his flinch is so real.
Yeah, that's how you get it.
Oh my God.
You terrify your actors in a safe way.
In a safe way, I guess so. Well, I'm trying to remember the very first time I saw it. Because it was in the theater, and I guess it was in the theater in Victoria where I grew up, and there was this theater called the Oak Bay. It's a beautiful theater, now gone. And I went because of, I'm not sure why, with Cronenberg and Walken, and I had an older boyfriend who liked Stephen King as a writer, and so had read it, and so we went to see it together, and it just was one of those moments. And then I watched it again later, sort of watching it on when it came into movies, or watching it renting it on DVDs, and trying to figure out why it felt so, those movies that just stay with you, but there's a kind of uneasiness about the way that they do, and you could try to unpack it or not, and I did a bit with that, and then I just gave up and thought it's probably the sad, thoughtful thing. I felt like that weirdly with that movie Australia, that Jeremy Irons movie, and such a weird movie.
No, I don't know if I do.
So it's a movie where the scene that I remember is this girl who never knew her mother because her mother died, sitting outside in the Australian outback watching projected films of her mother that she'd finally found. And it's that one scene is the scene that sticks with me. But it had that same effect. And it was sort of like, what is this? What is this, like, sort of touching into, or kind of disturbing a well of uncertainty and sadness that is sort of always there, ready to be kind of rippled through, or is there something else about it? Like they and this one has always done that to me. I've remembered it for years and years and years.
Is it that melancholy? Because both films sound like they're about lives that aren't lived.
It is melancholy, but it's not that I'm not a melancholy person, I don't think, but
this gave you that opportunity.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I remember being struck by how grown up it felt.
Yes.
And not just because it's about longing and the relationship that doesn't happen, but just it felt like it's a movie about responsibility, and shouldering things that you don't want and wearing that burden. And that was pretty weird to come out of what I thought was a Halloween horror movie in October of 1983.
Well, you're younger than I am. So I was 20 when I saw it.
Okay.
So I was probably already in that kind of, the romance of it, the romance of the romance that doesn't happen. Just felt sort of profoundly sad.
Yeah.
But maybe that's it. It did feel adult. It felt like all the themes of any great, like you think about the big the big picture and books like War and Peace and Dostoevsky and the moral dilemmas in Crime and Punishment. It's all there in that movie. It's the same things, those same big questions, but just put into this strange sort of thriller format, which they just don't go together.
Yeah.
But they go together in this movie.
This one time, yeah, it all works. Well, yeah, no, I just want to watch it again now.
So a Blu-ray has come out.
A Blu-ray is available in Australia.
Wow.
And I believe, even though it says Region B, it's all region playable. But it's a high-definition print. It's got most of the extras from the Paramount DVD
Oh, it does?
release. Yeah.
Okay.
There's
What are the extras?
There are 4 featurettes, and there's a commentary, but it's not with Cronenberg.
Okay, interesting.
I don't think he's ever done one for this. He's done them for most of his films. But the Dead Zone, again, it was like a redheaded stepchild at Paramount. They just never gave it that. They released sort of a half-assed special edition with the featurettes that are there, but I don't think he ever got him to do a commentary for it.
But you see, that's sort of the interesting thing too, because if it is that kind of, it was forgotten, it feels to me like the first film that really showed that he could master that complexity, and move on from, I don't know, it opened him up in a way. So you'd expect it to have a little bit more fanfare there.
Yeah. Especially now too. I mean, maybe it's because people are afraid to start talking about it because it involves an assassination of a Trump-like candidate, and who knows where that leads you in the post 9/11 universe.
Yes.
The paranoia that's running around. But yeah, definitely deserves some rediscovery. Maybe it'll just turn up on Shudder or something, and people will rediscover it by accident. That weird movie with Christopher Walken and the gun.
Wasn't there an announcement about partnering? I'm going to look up my email. Partnering to old television and movie content that was. I got invited to. You don't know what this is.
No, I don't know.
Just wait.
Get so many of these things thrown at me these days.
Yeah, there's the efficiency of the story is something to be admired. Cronenberg has never been long-winded.
Yeah.
And that's something that I appreciate. Okay, YouTube and Canada Media Fund. Google Canada and the Canada Media Fund will host a reception to celebrate the launch of CMF's new YouTube channel dedicated to bringing back memorable Canadian television shows and feature films. But
this is an American production, right?
Is it?
Paramount, I think. Oh. It's probably outside the window. Who knows? Maybe they'll throw it in.
Maybe. That's good. Great idea.
Better that than The Littlest Hobo. The complete archive online of The Littlest Hobo. This is the true purpose of Canada 150. The Littlest Hobo and the Beachcombers together forever.
I lived in Roberts Creek, which is just up the coast from Gibson's Landing for a year. And I remember watching that show. I found it terribly boring because I grew up in that landscape, so I didn't really, I didn't get it. But I had a motorcycle, and so I'd ride over onto the ferry, and then I always had to circle through, kind of wind through Gibson's Landing on my way up the highway to Roberts Creek. That was an interesting year.
So is there footage of you buzzing the set? Are you in the background of it?
Maybe. Well, I don't know. When was that show? I guess it was being... How long did it go for?
For years, wasn't it?
So it must have been. That's right, because people used to talk about it. And there was a Gibson Landing newspaper and a Seashell newspaper. And I was the reporter for the Gibson's Landing newspaper. And there was another reporter for the Seashell one, and they were more right-wing, and the Gibson Landing one was left-wing. And so we'd go together and sit at these, there was a trial for somebody, and we would sit together at the table. We were the only two press for the local news.
Oh, wow.
That was my job for a year in Roberts Creek.
It's a great gig. You learn so much about the community. I remember when I was at Ryerson for journalism school, I was only there for a year, but we covered trials, we covered municipal hearings. It was just, be a student and learn and listen and watch people. That's an incredible education. Even if you don't write anything about it, you just...
Oh, it's amazing. And that was that was before I went back to school, but I was kind of... It was interesting to wake up in the morning and hear the sea lions and stuff. It was very beautiful there. I think it's much more built up now. But you were at... Why did you only go for a year? Oh, I was
writing for the Star already as a freelancer, and they offered me a column, the home video column, video file in 90... Yeah, it would have been like April 91 when we started talking about it. It was the end of my first year, and I just asked my prof, obviously I'm going to take this, but should I come back? And she said, no, you'll learn more doing this you'll learn more writing for them than you will here. So, yeah.
That's really interesting. And the program is just so much more. I mean, I'm part of an advisory group for Ryerson, and through all of the School of Image Arts, right, and Media Arts and journalism. It's an incredible program.
Yeah.
I know. No, it's really film, media arts, and the way that and photography and all of it, which is changing so rapidly, right? And so how you maintain, what if somebody wants to work in they're doing everything in VR or AR, right? What does that mean? What is that, does that fall more into the photography? Does it fall into media? It's not filmmaking. It's weird. It's a hybrid of the two, and yet everything is lens-based. So you think, okay, well, this is an interesting direction to go in. If somebody wants to do their thesis, they should be able to do it. But how do we provide the resources to help people figure out what to do?
Yeah, and it's almost like gaming with a camera.
Yes.
I've been trying to figure that out too, because we don't know how to address it. We don't know how to articulate what it's going to be. Nobody knows. But when you're the one who's trying to figure out a way to describe it to people with text, it's a nightmare. It can be literally anything.
It's hard. It's really hard. For us, I mean, what we're doing with Anthropocene and trying to use augmented reality and maybe 360 VR, we haven't quite cracked a non-educational 360 experience. And educationally great. Like, it works for us to talk about extinction and have high school students see, the ivory tusk cloud burning and that kind of thing. But the difference between experiential and arbitrary, like there's an arbitrariness about 360 that I find frustrating, and it always sort of, there has to be some kind of authorship, and I'm not saying that from an egotistical perspective, but from a direction perspective. There has to be some kind of direction, because otherwise you're just looking at information. And I've always said that you have to, as a documentary filmmaker, you have to have a plan, but be ready to abandon it at any moment. So if you have no plan, then you are being arbitrary. But if you have too much of a plan, then you're not seeing what is around you.
Yeah.
And that's a weird place to live. It's a hard place to be, because it's much better to feel in control and say, I know what I'm doing. It's easier. Yeah. And then on the other hand, there's something very loose about just saying, well, let's shoot everything and see what happens. You can't do that either. So something about 360 hasn't quite cracked that arbitrariness. Like, why am I here? Right?
I think that's the greatest problem I have with virtual reality experiences, is that I am always aware that there's an end point that I'm not aware of, that it wants me to find something or do something. And because the people building these experiences are coming from gaming and cinema together, like, they're just trying to they're trying to prod you and nudge you, and that becomes annoying, because if there's a little sparkly light over here, but I want to look at the tree,
I know
the sparkly light just gets sparklier. And I think for you as a documentary filmmaker, that is you're the one wandering around and figuring out what to curate, but then you create the experience for me that is an A to B narrative, because that's how cinema works.
Yeah, but there is a way. I mean, I would say that in our work, especially our work with Ed, that there was always an attempt to be experiential and not didactic. So the idea of 360 was an opportunity to extend the experiential into a different medium. But how do you do that in a way that is meaningful?
Right.
And it's a really interesting conundrum, because I was thinking about it when in Manufactured Landscapes, and when I used to talk about the last scene in that film where the woman with the red scarf over her face is riding her bike through that wasteland, which was just, we're going back to Beijing, and we're driving, on some long hours long bus ride, and this is a suburb, and so we kind of stop and like, where are we? And we got out because there was all this construction, there were piles of coal, there's a coal burning plant, like all of this stuff in the same area. And you realize this was a neighborhood where people lived. It wasn't an industrial park. I don't know why people say park, like an industrial wasteland. It wasn't that. outside of the city. This was where people were living, and all of these things were happening in that environment. And there was some dreadful, like, open plain of, with the whatever it was on the ground was not dirt,
that
some kind
sort of metallic sewage,
ash kind of, and there's a kid riding their bike and people are playing with a ball because there's no other place to do that. And I did a 360, and I talk about I did a 360 and saw nothing natural left except for a few weeds. There were no birds, there were no trees, there was no, and I thought, oh my God, this is the future. So I was trying to think about that moment and say, okay, if I was going to try to create that moment for someone else, that moment of being in a place you're connected to but would never see, how do you do that in VR? Is there a way of doing that in VR? That's what we're trying to do. I don't know.
Bring them to a realization? Is that what you're...
Bring them to a realization, but simply through the fact of witnessing the place. Mm-hmm. Like, you can't be in the tannery of Bangladesh without going, holy shit, this is a medieval, I could be in a totally different century right now. And I'm probably wearing the shoes that were made here. Like that kind of, and it goes beyond just a recognition of, guilt or here I am, I'm responsible for this. It's a connectedness. But these places are weird. It's weird to be underground in a salt mine in the Ural Mountains of Russia. It's weird to be up in an industrial city in the north that's closed. It's a closed city, Norilsk. That's where we were in the summer. Nobody goes there. So that what is it like to be here? That this cell phone has metals in it that were probably collected from that mine. So what does it look like? That's a job that 360 can do, but we haven't figured it out.
Yeah, I'm fascinated to see what the result will be.
Yeah,
when you get the answer.
If we get the answer is the operative word.
Okay. Well, let me ask you the final question for the podcast then, which is just basically, is there anything? I mean, we've talked about resonances and emotional connections. Is there anything in the film is there anything in the Dead Zone that you've referenced or used or absorbed into your own creative DNA over the years? Do you ever find yourself thinking about it in terms of your work?
It's interesting because when I say that I went on to study all of these things before I became a filmmaker, philosophy, theology, these questions of these big questions, right? That drew me. That movie, I'm not saying that movie was the only thing that brought that up for me, but that movie was one of those things that brought up that question of what about that extra layer? What about that metaphysical layer of meaning, whether it exists or not? And I'm not going to even, I can say I believe that, but it doesn't, I'm not going to make a claim that it does exist or not. But something was triggered by that movie. And I would say that the path I went on to do, every single one of our films references some kind of metaphysical layer or bigger problem that goes beyond the actual the obvious subject matter. Because of that, because of those things. So the Paul Bowles film is kind of a film about the impossibility of biography. It's identity theory in some way. What is it to describe another person? The true meaning of pictures is about the politics and ethics of representation and what that means, and just sort of The Holier It Gets was a film about the impossibility of confessional work and how, what is it that, why is it that the more personal you get, the more you can resonate with others, right? And what is the eye of the needle that you have to go through of honesty, like a painstaking, brutal honesty in order to make that connection without selling out, without, resorting to voyeurism, So I would say that the act of God.
That was the one that first occurred to me.
Is about, it's that thing, like how can something like this happen to you in life and you not ascribe meaning to it? And all of the people that we talked to were either just immediately convinced that it was a message from the heavens or something else, or the opposite. They strove mightily to avoid ascribing meaning to it. And then in the end, their lives were completely changed by it anyway.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, I told you my lightning story the first time we met, I think, was that I was almost hit by lightning at a restaurant. This is more for the people listening to the podcast, outside of a pub in Toronto. And when that was probably around 1995 or 96. And then Kate and I were at home in a lightning storm in 2003, and I told her this story, and she said she was there. And
really?
Yeah, she was working in the neighborhood, and she and her friends had also been trapped in by the lightning storm that we were, and they were just in a different part of the restaurant, and they heard that some guy almost got hit by lightning, and she, reader, I married him. It's it's just an incredible, you want there to be a reason for that, and it is just a coincidence, because that was her immediate response as well. I mean, the odds are, you live there, I worked here, we were going to be in the same place.
But come on.
It's wonderful,
Can you
right?
see the poetry in it? It's the mathematics of it. The mathematics can be poetic too. You're right.
I think I've worn her down. I think she sees it now.
Good. Because the whole film is about that tension. And of course even though Paul Auster won't admit exactly that experience, I think, precipitated this lifelong obsession with chance.
Oh, you
and
see
meaning.
it in his books, absolutely.
Every single book is about that in some way. And you kind of go, wait a minute, why it was the guy right before you who was going under the fence, who got hit,
right
and not you, the kid.
Which is even
they were
more
all kids.
primal, right?
I know. But so all the films have that to a certain extent, I would say, and not deliberately or not sort of hopefully not heavy-handedly, but more that's what drives them. This problem that is not easy to figure out. This ethical thing, this metaphysical thing, whatever, and so for that, I mean, even the last one, even the Hip film is about mortality, right? And so, really, I would say that they connect back to that on that level for me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm always glad when a work of art affects people that profoundly, and I'm really glad when it turns out to be something that people just aren't talking about anymore. So this has really been a great opportunity to bring it back in.
Everybody to watch that movie again. Yeah. Order it from Australia or find some way. I found it on, I don't even know if it was, maybe not iTunes. I found it. I was able to rent it.
There, yeah.
Yeah.
But Blu-ray, it is gorgeous. I mean, those winter scenes in proper 35mm film stock, it just looks great.
And that beautiful shiny tunnel, within the rain, like that kind of where is that tunnel? It's creepy as hell.
Where something awful is waiting.
Yes.
Your perfect Cronenberg image, right? Yes. You're lured in, and whatever's in there is going to be bad.
Yes.
And that's the other thing too. He was talking about this at the time. I dug up an old interview, and he said that he's not afraid of a story spiraling down, and I think that's part of it too. Like this, The Fly, Dead Ringer, Scanners Video, almost all of his films end with the destruction of the protagonist, whether it's death or just dissolution.
That's true.
I think Naked Lunch is the first time somebody more or less survives, and he's never going to be the same. But he was just that sense from the very beginning that this isn't going to go well, that everything has menace, that this lovely ersatz New England is just waiting to hurt you.
Yes.
Penetrates, it gets right in.
And what's so fascinating about it too, though, is that even though there is that, and there is that emotional depth, his intellectual approach makes it bearable in some way, I feel.
Yeah.
It makes it understandable and bearable. So you're not just, it's not a tearjerker. It's not a tearjerker at all. It's a very intellectual movie that still has this emotional core to it. And that's quite a feat as well, because, that's a feat.
My thanks to Jennifer Baichwal, whose new documentary Long Time Running, co-directed by Nick DePontier, friend of the show, is now streaming on Crave TV in Canada and coming to Netflix in the rest of the world on November 26th. Canadians who don't have Crave TV can catch it on VOD this Friday, November 17th, and a North American Blu-ray and DVD release will follow December 1st. However you watch it, you should play it loud. Jennifer is not on Twitter, but you can find her production company, Mercury Films, at Mercury Films, all one word, and you can find The Dead Zone on DVD from Paramount Home Entertainment in the US and Canada. That Australian Blu-ray I mentioned is indeed all region, and I'll post a link to it on the show's Twitter account. You can also find the film on iTunes and Google Play. Oh, and that was Azura Sky as Cassie Newton in that episode of Buffy I mentioned, and of course she also came back for the episode Conversations with Dead People. As always, you can find me on Twitter at Norm Wilner and elsewhere on the internet at nowtoronto.com. You can also find this podcast on Twitter at Semcast, S-E-M-Cast, and on the web at someoneelsesmovie.com. If you want to leave a review up on iTunes or Apple Podcasts or wherever, that would be greatly appreciated. I love you too, Gord. Thanks for listening.